Well, welcome to the Menlo Midweek podcast, everybody. My name is Mark.
My name is Jessica, as she took a big drink of
thirsty.
coffee.
Yep. And we have Phil with us.
What's up, everybody? The gang's back together.
Woohoo! We're here. We're doing it.
Mark,
Yes.
we had a Mark replacement last week.
Yeah, much an improvement and replacement from the episode that I listened to. That
We
was
should
great.
do an episode that is Mark Mornishi and Mark Kim, and we could just call it Mark Squared.
And Mark Swerner.
Oh, Mark to the power of three.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole podcast right
Trinity.
there.
Yeah.
The Trinity.
The Markinity.
Yep.
I like it.
Where were you?
I was on a nice, refreshing trip in the mountains of Utah, the Boulder Mountains. Never been there before.
That sounds like a oxymoron. The mountains of Utah.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of weird because growing up in California and going to the Sierras, it's like jaggedy, pointy mountains, right? With snow all over them. Utah is just kind of like you climb up and there's a plateau and you climb up. So it's like we're going to the top of that big flat thing over there and it's going to be like 11,000 feet in the air. And I'm like, how? But you're just kind of climbing up the whole time. So it was really fun. The weather was like the last little bit of springtime where it was kind of cold, kind of windy, kind of rainy. But then we had a couple days of really good weather and just some great fishing. We tried to catch 7 different species of fish while we were there, and we caught 6 of the 7.
Oh, nice.
So count it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And were those, you were telling me about
Yeah.
the weird species there.
Yes.
Was that what you caught?
Yeah, I caught a few of the weird ones. Utah manages their fisheries very interestingly, and so they're a very hands-on approach as opposed to a hands-off approach like what we take here. And so they hybridize a bunch of their trout to make like mutant trout that are,
Like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
these ones, I definitely caught a lot of teenagers and saw some of the bigger fish that I wanted to catch, but just could not convince them.
Yeah.
But yes, caught some really weird ones. And then
Did any of them have nunchucks?
none had nunchucks,
pizza.
but they looked like
Yeah,
they had little bandanas on. I think they're still in training.
Training.
They're
There
still
was
in training.
4. We
there
had
a
a red
giant
one,
They had like
a blue one.
foam nunchucks, but like not the real ones yet, you know?
Yes.
And then there was this little rat running around with them. It was really weird.
This is our childhood nostalgia right here.
If you don't know what we're talking about,
Well, speaking of
Google
nostalgia,
it.
we had a childhood series that we're
Yes.
talking about, and we opened up this last weekend. I listened to it on the way home from Utah. No, on the way home from Orange County to here. And I was like, I want to listen to the podcast. But wait, I put the podcast up. So then I had to put the podcast up so that I could listen to it. But I was
What a good
so
reminder.
glad that I did because it was a really great way to set up the stage and open up the series. And I'm super pumped for it. It's going to be a
Yeah.
fun summer.
Yeah, I think when we were kind of doing some planning for series development and stuff, there's some series that I think are uniquely Menlo topics that I think we're just built as a community to not just like have somebody talk about from up front, but for our community to absorb and not freak out. And I think this is one of those series. So I'm thankful for it. And having been here now for, 6 months or so, to be able to step into a series like this that hopefully feels foundational, like a kind of thing we're going to be able to reference back to for folks. It's really helpful. So week 1, so far so good.
So how did we come up with the series? I mean, I know that we have like our normal process is that we have a team that gets together and they talk about ideas, flesh through maybe, what kind of series that we want to have, whether that's a book study or topical study or something like this, where it's a little bit different for all of us. And so how'd that come about and why'd we land on it for summer?
Yeah, so the summer experience of church is usually one where you're planning series that are a little bit longer in like just series density because it's a longer period of time than you would normally do like a 4 to 6 week series. And then you also want to do it in a way that if somebody misses one, because with summer travel, that's quite common, that they can show up to another one and it doesn't feel like they're walking into the 3rd chapter of a book that they didn't start. And so how do you do it in a way that feels, in Greek grammar world, punctiliar? And so I think this series was built with both of those things in mind. It let us take kind of a longer narrative arc. It let us do something in a way that, especially for church folks, which are oftentimes the people who come to church in the summer, something like lots of these stories, they will have some, flannel graph version of. They'll have some memory of learning these stories. And that may be the last time that they've ever really thought about or processed them. But then on the flip side, we can hopefully go, hey, here's what kind of the rest of it is. And we'll talk about kind of deconversion and deconstruction. But I think a lot of that comes from just like the fact that we we grow older, but we don't necessarily grow up. We grow up, but we grow out of our faith. And so hopefully giving people permission to acknowledge that and take some steps to counteract it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to toot my own horn a little bit because I was honored to be invited to our big, year-long series planning meeting. And this was one of my ideas. I have been pitching this idea. I started in student ministries with my first boss here at Menlo. I was like, we should do a deep dive on the other parts of the stories that we learned growing up. And I've pitched it and I've pitched it and I've pitched it. Here we are 10 years later, and one of my ideas finally got taken. And I am so excited.
Yeah.
I think the series graphic, if you haven't seen it, turned out
it's really cool.
so incredible. I mean, you'll see it. Our bumper video was super fun. It's just a fun little story to set up featuring somebody's wonderful kids. And it's just it has the nostalgia feel of if you grew up in the church in the 80s and 90s, or if you grew up in the church period, you were taught these stories in a fun, usually unique, engaging way, whether that's puppets or flannel graphs or I don't even know, what did they do before that? Pictures? Chalkboards.
Overhead transparency.
Ooh, I was a transparency guy.
I was too. That was middle school, doing the lyrics. Yep. So yeah, this series is super, super exciting, and I think this first week was a great way to set it up and not just we're gonna take every story and ruin it for you, but what does that actually look like to dig into these stories, and how do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, and hopefully with the lens that I believe that the Bible is inspired, infallible, inerrant in so much as it reflects the original autograph. So a lot of what that means is obviously we have lots of translations and iterations over time. But I think what sometimes happens when we do series like this is we create a series, or you read a blog post or a book or something, and basically it's hey, how do we bring how smart we are to how stupid the Bible is? That's the feeling. Maybe that's just my skepticism coming to the surface. But I think our hope is that we can help folks understand that sort of the sandbox of these conversations is much larger, that unity does not mean uniformity, that we can hold to an authoritative understanding of the Scriptures and come to different understandings of how to understand and interpret these stories. And that's okay. And so hopefully that'll be permission giving for folks.
Yeah. And you said earlier that Menlo is one of the few spaces in which a message series like this can exist. What do you think makes Menlo that place?
I think our church is uniquely positioned, right? We're in this place of just a rigorous nature of pursuit kind of everywhere, not just faith, I would say just life in general. Somebody walked up to me after a service this weekend and they were like, hey, I'm a physicist. Here's some feedback I have. And I was like, oh, awesome. Nobody's taking my word for it in Menlo, And so you get to have just really great, thoughtful conversations. The number of people that have advanced degrees and for them, I think if they're following Jesus, somewhere along the way they either decided that their faith had to sort of be quarantined in their brain where they couldn't ask these questions or it would undermine their faith, or they've done this work themselves and they're sort of wondering when the church is going to catch up because they did this already, but sometimes when they come to church it still feels like a flannel graph version of some of these core essentials. And so I think that's helpful. And I think even kind of the unchurched community beyond us, if they walk in and we don't talk about things like this, I think we just feel so culturally tone deaf that it's not helpful. So nobody's coming to church in Menlo because they have to. Everybody's coming because they're making a choice. And if somebody is skeptical to faith, I think one of the challenges is we have this pretty even split between people that have past church experience and people who have no past church experience. But both of them as adults, I think, kind of need the same thing, which is an intellectually honest and rigorous pursuit of faith. So,
Yes. And I loved how in the message you said something, Jess and I were talking about this earlier, a line that you used that basically said if you don't grow up or growing up with faith. Do you remember it, Jess?
Does Phil remember it? I think is the question.
Sorry. It was growing with depth. And
if our faith doesn't grow up with depth,
that's right,
we will grow out of it with doubt.
Yes.
Yep.
I love that. And because that this series isn't just about those that grew up in the church either, and you kind of acknowledge that as well, where whether you did experience this flannel graph faith or this is your first time hearing it, these questions are still relevant. And so I love how we are addressing both audiences, but also trying to deepen where we are, whether we're starting here or whether we started 10, 15, 30, 50, 70 years ago.
Yeah. And I think a big part of, I mean, for me, a big part of preaching, we talked about it before, is this kind of double-barreled approach to preaching where you're constantly talking to church people and unchurched people at the same time. And, you know, there are going to be some messages that tilt one way or another, but being able to sort of give a nod to, like, hey, if you didn't grow up in church and this is weird, I get it. Like, all right, let's keep going. Just like continuing to get people on the train with you, I think is super essential if you want them to continue to engage in the conversation. So
Definitely.
I think one word that maybe you said it in your sermon, maybe not, but it's kind of a big word out there right now is deconstruction. So if you haven't heard that, it's kind of like, you know, you grew up with this faith or this belief or whatever, and as you get older, you're learning a little bit more, and you're kind of like, wow, there's actually some stuff that I was taught that maybe wasn't correct, or whether it was taught like the way you read the Bible or the church that you grew up in or the people that you surrounded you with, and kind of taking that down piece by piece and figuring out what the you know, what the truth is or what the reality is. So do you feel like this, what's a good question here, how do we deconstruct in a healthy way, and how does that relate to this series even at all?
100%. Yeah. And it was kind of written with that in mind. I would say, you know, nothing's new under the sun. I read that somewhere. And I think one of the things that's challenging is that we live in a culture that is so quick to label things. We're so quick to be like, well, we're the first ones to think about, oh, we got it. We know the term. And I think part of that is sort of the identity politics, tribalization of our moment. And so deconstruction, I think, has certainly become somewhat of a social contagion. But I also think it has existed for way more than this moment.
Yeah.
And so, you know, whether that was, you know, in college, somebody challenged your faith and you had to reconcile your faith to your biology class, or you had to figure out as a young professional, what did it mean to integrate your faith experience to your current life experience, or you were in a serious relationship and the Bible had a vision of sexual fulfillment inside of marriage, and you didn't in that moment feel as much pressure to conform to that image as you did the image and pressure that you felt elsewhere. Like we've had all of that, right? And I think now we just have this like kind of bigger category of deconstruction. And I would say if this is you going through this, or I think especially a lot of times if you're listening to a podcast like this, it's someone you know that's going through that. And I think the first step is to just not freak out. Like the number one, just do not freak out. I also think that if this is somebody you know, I wrote down kind of 4 potential causes of deconstruction that I think are really important to do the work with that person to understand which of these are we talking about. Because oftentimes I think we all bring an assumption of which one of these this person is dealing with, and with that we bring judgment. And usually it is at least a combination of multiple, oftentimes having nothing to do with the thing you're thinking about. I think the first one is painful church experiences, like people who have, it's actually not a theological problem. Like I've heard somebody talk about this idea before that they've never talked to someone who's deconstructed where the problem was Jesus, ever. Like not a single person. It's always some other thing. And a lot of times it's like abusive church leadership, or they were volunteers for decades and just like were exhausted and they didn't know what to do, or this decreasing institutional trust and they watched one more documentary about another fallen pastor and they're like, I'm sure this is us too. You know, I think that's one category. The second one I think is superficial discipleship. And so we have actually grown up sort of in the mega church movement. This is a pretty new concept, even in the last 50 years, certainly in the grand scheme of church history. But this idea that your entire discipleship process is attend church, give financially, get involved in a group, and serve. That's the entire vision of your discipleship experience. That is not the entire picture of the discipleship experience of the New Testament. And so if that's it, over the course of time, you're going to be exposed to things on the internet and social media and in a more hyper-connected world where it's going to be tricky to sustain that. The third one I think that we have to admit is sinful justification, that I think our moment is smarter than those stupid people that wrote the Bible, so I know better. Let me reinterpret the Bible based on my 2023 perspective and worldview. Or I go, I just want to do this thing, and so I need to find a way to rationalize the behavior that I want to choose. And I think all of us have that inside of us. Like before we throw a lot of shade at somebody that's trying to deconstruct, I have that in me. You have that in you. Not like Mark, just like you in the collective. And then emotional reasoning, I could get into a lot of stuff about that culturally, but the idea that we have communicated as a culture that feelings are either safe or unsafe, and therefore when I experience discomfort, that is unsafe, and so therefore I bring emotional reasoning where I go, if I feel bad, I must be in a dangerous spot. If I feel good, that must be a good thing, and I bring that to sort of this justification of deconstruction. It's why a lot of times we talk about things like safe spaces, and even some of the most recent research says that when we give trigger warnings or we talk about safe spaces, they're not working, right? And part of that is because emotional reasoning is actually very, very unhealthy. And then the fourth one I would just say, and I mentioned it already, is social contagion, that there's a group maybe, or it's something on social media where it's like, oh, I want to be associated with this tribe. It's fun. It's cool. It's current, and I'm going to jump on board with it. And I think how we approach, whether we're dealing with this personally or we're trying to love and care for someone who's going through this, it really, I think we have to, at a minimum, just ask some questions to figure out which one of these things that we're talking about, because there's a different approach based on the ones we're talking about. So.
As you ran through those, my mind went to those are all pieces of identity, of how you can identify or set your perspective about what's around you in order to either, fit into one of those categories or just to try to interpret the information that we're given, which is we're flooded with that. And so how can someone set their identity? Yes, I am a Jesus follower. I grew up this way. I have these stories, I heard these stories growing up, like the creation story. And now I'm presented with four, like, ways that you did in this message, or a billion others.
More of them. Yeah, there's lots of them.
So how can I approach that in a way that I can still have my identity as, yes, I love Jesus, but I'm trying to sort this out for myself?
Yeah, well, I think part of it begins with, what do you need, right? Like, there's an inherent tension in all of us in these conversations that isn't always the same, right? So I got an email. I'm going to go see if I can find it real quick. I got an email this week from somebody after the message, and they were like, what did they say? Oh, yeah, here we go. Want to thank you for Sunday's sermon. I wrestle a lot with reconciling my faith with science. The common narrative is that science and the Bible are at odds. The loudest people on both sides seem determined to increase this divide, using the rationale of their opinions to shout out their opposition. But within my own beliefs, I've never found this divide to be more than superficial. I'm an intuition-based thinker. To me, part of the genius of the creation story in Genesis is that it remains true in structure compared to the Big Bang Theory, which is the best that science can currently provide. In my own head, I can let the details slide. The time scales from science, billions of years, don't really have much meaning to our limited brains. You might as well say it was all over in 6 days. 6 days is easier to understand, easier for a child to understand, 6,800 years. If I summed up all history, is easier to understand. So it keeps going, but I think, clearly in that context, you have somebody that goes, I am more comfortable with a level of ambiguity to this conversation. Like, it's not as big of a deal to me. But if I am... let's say evolutionary biologist, right? Trying to follow Jesus, like, I got a hunch this is a bigger conversation.
Yeah.
And we will probably touch pressure points that are different for you, for different people over the course of the whole summer. That's the point of it, right? This next weekend, Adam Hendricks, friend of the show, who is just, Adam is one of the best hangs. Like, he's such a good dude, and I love the way he thinks. I got to review his message for this weekend yesterday. It's excellent. He is going to talk about Noah and a global flood. And that's another one for people. It's totally different than the sort of origin of the world stories. There's so much more emotion to it. Like, oh my goodness, do I really believe? Is this what the Bible actually, what kind of a God? All those questions show up. And so I think part of it, to your point, is, what does the integration of this pursuit look like? You don't have to wrestle every one of these things down to the ground for your faith to be formed. Part of it is becoming self-aware enough to know, what are those trouble spots for me? Maybe for you, because of your interest, it's going to be men and women in the Bible and the way that we see some things that we go, oh, I don't know how to understand or think about that. Or maybe it's, the nature of war in the Old Testament, or maybe it's the potential disconnect between how God reveals himself in the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think part of it is just understanding what some of those pressure points in faith are, and understanding the difference, I think, when that happens, between the baby and the bathwater. I think sometimes faith deconstruction, when it's unguided, when we don't understand the core essentials, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. When in reality, if somebody said, "Man, I'm so frustrated with the institutional church and this and this and this and another controversy and another cover up and another stupid thing," I'd be like, "Yeah, me too." That's totally get it. I'm on board. But if somebody's going, "Hey, I just want to sleep with my girlfriend. Like, I just want to move in with my significant other because I really want to, and we love each other, and God wouldn't want us to be apart." That's emotional reasoning. I'm like, well, I got a document that's a few thousand years old that would say he's got a better way for you to live your life. I mean, you're going to live it however you want, but there's going to be pain involved when we choose to live it outside of his will. So, I think that's a long answer to a short question, but I think part of it is just acknowledging the fact that you're going to be chasing down tensions that are unique and personal to you, and your tensions may be different. Your tensions will be different than mine, and that's okay. That's totally okay. What do you think, Jess?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think when you asked that question, my initial reaction was just reminding for me, my biggest thing was reminding myself that the people that taught me this are human, and that we get stuff wrong. We interpret the Bible wrong, we read the Bible wrong, and they were doing the best they could with the resources that they had at the time. And I don't think I was ever taught anything biblically wrong. Well, maybe I was, I don't know. But a lot of the stuff that I've been processing through has been more of like the purity culture thing that we all talk about and stuff like that. And just the way, that was just, I mean, it still is prevalent today in some ways, some splats. But I think it's so easy to get mad at the way things were, the way that you were taught, the church that you grew up in, the people that you surrounded yourself, the people your parents put in your life. When in reality, it's like that, for the most part, that is what they knew, and they were doing the best that they could. And so it's more about, you talked about this at Christmas, actually, Phil, and you used this line again, that the Bible is the authority of our faith, and Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is the foundation of our faith. And so for me, that's been the biggest thing. And we did a really cool series last summer called Being Human, where it was all just about Jesus. And that's the most important part of it. And so it's like, yes, it sucks that I'm relearning all these things that I thought I knew. And it sucks that there's so many things that I don't understand. But in the end, like you said, like my foundation is Jesus and the way he lived my life, the way he lived his life. And that's the most important thing. So when we put our focus on that and who he was and what he believed in and what he stood up for and who he stood up for, that's the end all be all to me.
And I think it's really important that, that's well said. I think it's really important that we don't, I know there's like red letter Christians, right? That are like, I only believe, my theology is only in what Jesus himself said. And I think that is a challenging theological worldview, because Jesus himself affirms the Hebrew Scriptures.
Right.
And I would say that church history regularly affirms the veracity, consistency, and supernatural nature of the New Testament Scriptures. So, if that's you, I totally get it. But I think what's really hard is, I've heard it described as like a house of cards. And if the house of cards of my faith is built on a 6-day literal creation or a global flood, or, insert reference, and then I have one conversation with one person that challenges my thinking, and my faith has to become so rigid, so ready to fight for its unique and personal interpretation. Nobody else can be right. There can be no variety or turning of perspective. And I would argue we're seeing that on a national scale right now, at a denominational level, at times where you're like, we're gonna lose unity over this. Like we're gonna blow up over that. I think that becomes really difficult, when in reality, if you go, hey, the church grew at maybe its fastest rate in history before Ta Biblia, before the 66 books that we understand as the Bible today, was even recognized. And how did it do it? Because of the testimony of a group of people that were around Jesus. And because of the fact that he came and lived a perfect life, died on our behalf, and then really did come back from the dead. That's what did it. Like that's what was the catalyst. And so I think understanding that as our origin, then when somebody goes, well, I'm not sure about a global flood. I'm not sure about 7-day creation. Cool. Like great. Like my faith it is not founded on those ideas. Now, they are the authority for my life, and I'm going to try and wrestle them down to the ground and grow deeper in my understanding of them. And I think hopefully this summer what you'll discover is there are thoughtful men and women who have pursued Jesus for a long time that have answers and investigations for all of these conversations. This idea that, and I didn't say this line, I thought of it after the weekend. I think a lot of non-Christians today, here's what they feel like the choice is. I can either be a smart atheist or a stupid Christian. Like those are my choices. And I hope what this series reveals is that that's just not true. There are stupid atheists and there are smart Christians, you know. They're not mutually exclusive. And so if it's just I need to pursue that more, I think that's great. I also think what you talked about around this idea, Jess, of the people were doing the best that they could. I heard it described this way recently in a podcast, that sometimes as Christians, we have forgotten in America our ideas and the way we think about things is formed over time. It is. There's no way around it. And I think sometimes we think about it like they're hatched, like they're just created in a moment. And if you want to be kind of uncomfortable, there's a book, I don't agree with every page of it, called Jesus and John Wayne.
Oh, I've heard.
And it's really kind of like a history textbook of like, how did we get here? And so it's not necessarily descriptive of any individual church or certainly not Menlo, but I would say if you're kind of looking around and you're like, how did evangelicalism become a swear word in America? That book can be really, really helpful in just kind of diagnosing some of that. So for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, I've heard that's a good book.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think a lot too. We were taught to not question the Bible, not question your faith, don't question your pastors. And I actually saw this Instagram post this morning, and I posted it, and I'm assuming it's correct, so maybe you'll know if it is. In the Gospels, Jesus is asked 187 questions. He answers maybe 8 of them. He himself asks 307. Maybe faith isn't about certainty, but learning to ask and sit in the complexity of good questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, there's great knowledge and wisdom on the other side of exploration. I think sometimes what we want is we want certainty without exploration. And again, I don't think the answer is remove all certainty. Like I think there are things that we can go, man, I'm certain I believe this. Like faith is the assurance of things not seen. And so I think we have to understand what are those essentials of our faith and what are those things where we have sort of Christian liberty, where we can go, we can understand and think about this differently. And I think that historically in conservative evangelicalism in the West, curiosity has been a little bit of like it's been a dangerous idea. And when you look at the Hebraic mind and the way that folks would have been taught in the school of rabbinical teaching that Jesus was functioning within, curiosity was actually rewarded. It was there by design. So they had core essentials. They had non-negotiable essentials, but then they had a much bigger list of things that were sort of like open for conversation. And Jesus was great about sort of just seamlessly going from one to another in a way that I think for us, it's like, here's the textbook. Yeah, don't think about this for yourself. Don't do any of the work. Just read it, believe it, live it. And that is, a pretty compartmentalized Western way of thinking. We want people to have Orthodox faith, but we also want people to have an Orthodox faith that can be rigorous. And the only way that faith can be rigorous is if people have done the work to discover it in part for themselves.
Yeah, my mind jumps to process. How are you arriving at your conclusions? Where are you in that process? And I don't know, Phil, do you think Jesus cares more about getting the right answer or the process of discovering the right answer?
Ooh.
I mean, I think that it's not a binary. Like, I think, I think Jesus longs for us more than anything else to be in increasingly deepening relationship with Him and with others. I think that there's great work of what process looks like, and I think that probably over the last however many decades, it's been an easy thing for Christian subculture to prioritize the answer and deprioritize the process. I think sort of the trendy thing right now is to prioritize the process and to be darn with the right answer. There are right answers. Like they actually, this idea of like, I'm not sure Jesus was a literal person. That's a big problem, right? I'm not sure Jesus literally came back from the dead. That's a big deal. Like inside of Christian faith, that would matter a lot. But asking the question, wrestling it to the ground, man, like I want you to be able to do that. We have men and women that have been doing this work longer than any of us have been alive, for literal millennia. And so I just love that church history and the testimony of Jesus followers can stand up to the scrutiny. So yeah, if you go, I just want to live into the process. Yeah, I would say that reflects sort of a new age, there is no ending point philosophy that I think we need to be concerned about. But I think if we go, well, you don't need to process because that's dangerous, just swallow this. I think that is a convenient Western way of usually instituting power over a relationship.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably a balance of both.
Yeah, definitely. And this must have been a very interesting message for you to try to put together, because it's very unique in the way that you've presented 4 different and opposing ideas to each other under the context of we're on this journey together to figure out how to have conversations around this. So how did you wrestle through preparing for this message, and how is it different than messages, let's say, from the last series?
Yeah, I mean, when you, I have some friends in town from Colorado, and they were like, it was like a college class, and in some ways it kind of is. Like when you do talks like this, for me, if you think about it from a preaching perspective, I actually think about services this way too. You think about it like a funnel. And so the beginning is the biggest part of the funnel. Like, how do we just get everybody here? How do we try to help everybody feel like this can be a conversation that they are qualified to have, that maybe they're interested in having? And so part of the work of that gets set before I ever walk up, right? That's a bumper video, that's graphics, that's the way the rest of the service has been stewarded. And then, going to the flannel graph, talking through kind of the Genesis account, that is such like an all skate. Everybody gets it. Even if they didn't grow up in church, they have heard those words before. And then I think just acknowledging the tension that exists, like, why are we talking about this? And then there's 2 main types of preaching that happen. One is called inductive, where you wait till the very end and you sort of release the main idea to people. The other one is called deductive, which is here is the main idea that I'm going to keep telling you over and over again. That's more the type that I lean into. And so that line, who matters more than how and why matters more than when, that I said a few times and then I slowly expanded and tried to break down more and more. That's really a modified form of a deductive approach. And then I tried to start with, where do we all agree? Like, not just Christians, but actually non-Christians and Christians, this idea of Goldilocks zone and fine-tuning, unmoved mover theory, that the universe has a beginning, and highlight the fact that not like Bible history, just history tells us that's a new concept. Like, that's less than 100 years old. We've all thought that way, and the Bible's been telling us that for thousands of years. So that's pretty cool. Like, it's worth acknowledging that. And then the 4 views is helpful because there's great resources out there, and I try to point people to stuff if it's like, hey, if this is the most you've ever done on it and you just need a few weeks to process the last 20 minutes, cool. But if you're like, yeah, this is all beginner stuff, where do I go now? I try to give people a few breadcrumbs. And I will tell people where I stand on stuff. Like, I just think people are going to guess if I don't tell them. But I also try not to strawman the other arguments. Like, I try to communicate them in a way that's equitable and kind. And then what you'll see over and over again is once we do that, once we talk about sort of the specific subject, we're going to go, hey, where is Jesus in the middle of this? How do we find the gospel in the midst of this Old Testament narrative? We believe Jesus is really written through the entire Bible. Spurgeon says you should doesn't matter what passage you're in, like teach the passage and then make a beeline for the cross. And I've always really resonated with that. He probably used a different phrase than beeline, but you get the idea. And then Adam this week will he'll use some specific questions, right? I think his first question is like, is it true? Like, is this story true? And he does a great job kind of breaking down some various views there. So I think you'll see some of this type of framing throughout the series, and then we'll kind of consistently land at what do we do with it. And hopefully the Luxio Divina work will also help people both in a service and in their personal lives think about these stories in ways that they haven't before.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that Luxio Divina and our resources for this series?
For sure, yeah. So if you go to menlo.church/the rest of the story, you'll find kind of all the resources as they exist for the series now, and if we add anything over the course of the summer, including specific passages to try this Lectio Divina spiritual practice with, and kind of a write-up of it. But think about it, I talked about it this weekend, think about it like the difference between information transmission, which is sometimes the way our prayers can become reduced down to, versus sort of spiritual teleportation. That's overly reductionist, but everybody does it a little bit different. But like this weekend, I tried to go, hey, like let's take ourselves for a moment actually into the text, right? And it's a little hard to say, what did a formless and void universe smell like? That's a little harder. But it might be that when you're thinking about this text for this upcoming week around the flood, right? And you're reading a passage and praying through it, you're envisioning yourself literally on the ark, like with Noah. You're thinking about the anxiety that he is bringing to it. You're thinking about the mix of hope for the future and horror for what's just happened and responsibility, right? And you're just letting the humanity of the text, the feelings, the smells, the textures, the light, all of it kind of sort of absorb into your senses, because I believe that these things actually happened. And so even if you go, hey, my understanding of this text is different, cool. Like bring yourself to your understanding of the text, and let yourself actually live into it. If you've never tried this experience of prayer before, it's really, I would say, it's a great way to finish Bible study. So if you've never done this before, to be able to study a passage, to be able to do some work, what does this mean? What does this mean? And then finish that Bible study in an exercise of Lectio Divina, where you can kind of go, wow, I just sort of got some colors out of the crayon box I'd never used in this story before, and now I get to kind of put myself onto the page in a way that and this is not narcissistic exegesis. Like we're not becoming the hero of the story. We're just humbly placing ourselves as an observer in the story, and then going, all right, Jesus, what did you have to teach this character, this group of people, this situation, and what are those principles for me today?
Sounds fun.
It can be, yeah, and I think it can be
challenging.
Yeah, I think it can be really challenging, right? I think, one of the things that we'll talk about this upcoming week, around, I think this idea of Noah, and we see it over and over again in the Hebrew Scriptures, is a principle of God that we don't talk a lot about, which is God as judge. And this idea that like we are consistently trying to work backwards from like, does God really have to do that? I would say maybe the most common sort of deconstruction idea right now is that hell either does not exist or it's not eternal. And so there's some version of either something called annihilationism, where those who don't have a relationship with Jesus will eventually just no longer exist. I find that a very difficult concept to find in the Bible. Or they'll say, well, eventually everyone will become a Christian. Like eventually in eternity, everyone will become a Christian. That was sort of Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. That was kind of the punchline of the book. Again, like that's not, I would argue that's not the testimony of the Scriptures. I would want it to be the testimony of this. Like that's what I'm rooting for. But this idea of what we see in Noah, of God bringing temporary, short-term judgment for long-term redemption, we see that so often in the Hebrew Scriptures. Of like it's this big, divine, massive, societal level plan, and when we go, God, I wouldn't have done it that way. The text continues to respond with, well, His ways are not your ways. He's greater than you are. And so to be able to chase it down and wrestle it, fantastic. But if I'm working, I talked about it this weekend, if I'm working backwards from a intellectually arrogant bias that says, God, you bow to me, I would just say we should be careful about that when we come to the text. We should be approaching it with, God, you've given me a brain. I want to use my brain. You've given me a heart. I want to use my heart. And I still want you to be on the throne of my life. Would you help me to see it in this passage?
Yeah. It's a great approach and a great framework. I'm thinking about 4th of July coming up, people traveling back home, conversations around that table, that barbecue picnic table. How can we approach those conversations with this top of mind of, man, we're going to have conversations with people that probably don't agree with us. What's some great framework for that? What's some tips that you might have for us to be able to navigate those conversations well?
Yeah, there's a pod or a blog from Carrie Newhoff who does a podcast. We'll probably link it in the show notes, I bet.
Sure.
And it's helpful. It's kind of written for church leaders, but I think it's really helpful as you're thinking about that type of a situation. He gives a list of things to think about. But the first one is, remember that deconstruction doesn't always lead to deconversion. That, like, again, this is the don't freak out part. Like, we actually can hang for a minute. Number 2, know that while you are no longer an authority, you can be a guide. And I think even sometimes if you're like the church person in your family, and in years past, people would like come to you and be like, you're the Christian one, you know this answer. Honestly, now what may have felt like an asset 30 years ago feels like a liability today. And so how do you come alongside as the guide to say, I'm going to lead with questions like Jesus did. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to be kind. I'm going to be here and ready when they are. Avoid triumphalism. Don't be defensive, glib, superficial. We all know how to win an argument that we actually don't believe ourselves. And I think sometimes when you're talking with someone who's asking legitimate, difficult questions of their faith, and we're just kind of giving them the answer we know that will end the conversation, but that we don't even fully believe ourselves, that's not helpful. Like, I don't know is a perfectly reasonable answer. Let's discover that together. Yep. I'd love that. That's a great question. Like, those are all way better answers. Number 4, stop judging. Be sincere to open questions. I think that's great. Find the story. I think a lot of this is about what is the actual reason for where people are at. It's rarely theological. I would say more often it's about pain from their past that has gone unaddressed. Encourage people to follow the logical trail. Like I've heard it said, in the free marketplace of ideas, truth wins. And I think deconversion can sometimes be like, well, once I've lost my faith, now I'm categorized. I am now one of those. But continuing to challenge people, yeah, maybe the version of faith that you grew up with is not the version of faith you're going to carry into adulthood. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so there are great books, Reason for God, Tim Keller, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, that are thoughtful kind of treatise on core Christianity that is not trying to beat people over the head with a narrow view. And then 7, read more deeply. I think this is actually a huge part of what we're thinking about right now as we understand deconversion is we just have a lot of people that have read a handful of pretty entry-level things. They've read other people's chewed-up process, and they're going, I guess I'll take that person's word for it. And, there's a great book called The Shallows that's basically just talking about, it's not a Christian book, it's basically just talking about how surface level we've all become. And so I think for those of us that are following Jesus, our faith has got to continue to be more fully integrated in our life. We live in a culture that is more and more walking away from a biblical framework for understanding. And if you think you're going to swim in that water 99.9% of your week and 0.1% of your time is going to be, okay, Jesus, what do you have to say about my life? I'll tell you which one of those formation channels is going to win. It's a pretty easy conversation, right? And so I think we need to do that work. And then I think lovingly encouraging others like, hey, you are giving a lot of your personal formation and integration over to TikTok. And I just don't think it's working, right? And finding kind ways to call that out in other people. Oftentimes, I was in a group of people where they were talking about how sort of the new atheists, which was a movement of people, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, let's call it 10 years ago, that were very much in vogue. And there was this idea of, well, they could find these in this house of cards of modern Christianity. They could find these cards and pull it out. And that's true, right? Like, it's absolutely true. I would argue the modern atheists have become the same way. Like the modern kind of, we'll call it secular atheists, have become just as fragile and just as rigid in their worldview as they were critiquing Christians 10 or 15 years ago with.
Interesting.
And so I would argue it actually just takes one card pull of that worldview as well. And sometimes it's just learning enough about that to be able to dive into it. There's a great book called The Problem of God by Mark Clark. That's kind of his approach in that, is to sort of look at the secular worldview and lovingly, kindly be able to pull some fabric of it. So I will link that blog, but it's helpful. Carey brings great frameworks to stuff. He's a thoughtful leader. So
Great. Well, what else, Phil? Anything else that you want to speak about?
Yeah,
The series in general, or
I hope that for people that have sort of, there's two types of people in church. There's the people that are like, hey, I'm in here. This is just kind of what I do. I've stopped thinking about it. I talked about it this weekend. Like I have faith-based questions that have faith-based answers, and then I have like science-based questions that have science-based answers. And I just think those categories are overly reductionistic. I would say the Bible and God can handle your scrutiny. The Bible and God can handle your scrutiny. He wants your questions. One of my favorite books in the whole Bible is the book of Habakkuk in the Hebrew Scriptures. And Habakkuk goes at it with God, has very difficult, hard conversations, brings serious objections, and God meets him there. God doesn't wear the kid gloves. Basically, his first line to Habakkuk is like, "Put a cup on." Like it's a serious conversation. But
It's about to go down.
I mean, it's crazy, but it just frees us, I hope, to say God can handle it. You don't have to go like, my faith is so fragile. If you feel that way, that's more about how you're pursuing it than how it exists. And then I think there's another group of people that are slowly, maybe they're not changing their physical seat in the room in a campus, or they're not sitting further away from the screen watching church online, but they are emotionally moving further and further to the back door. Every week they're kind of going, this formation stuff of following Jesus, like I'm less and less interested, and this other stuff, these other pressures, these other things, they're drawing me more and more. And I hope that these conversations this summer give you reason to step back closer to Jesus being on the throne of your life, because he's the one that's actually designed to be there, and everything and everyone else that you try to place on the throne of your life, and there's only one throne, it will disappoint you. It will let you down because it's not built to handle who you are. You're created in the image of an all-knowing, all-powerful creator God. And when we say, yeah, but I want this other human being to be the leader of my life, I want this other worldview, this other ideology, this other pursuit, this other possession, man, I mean, even when we say it out loud, it doesn't sound like it makes sense, but we often don't examine it. So hopefully this summer will be a chance to examine.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Phil. Thanks for opening up this series. Thank you for all the work that you've done, and also for giving some opportunities for people like Adam and other perspectives to go ahead and chip in as well. I'm super excited for that.
Yeah, we're gonna hear from Adam this summer, Cheryl and Scott.
Yeah.
In the series. So I think it'll be great. Looking forward to hearing them, and it's a fun series. It'll be a change of pace at summer, and I think it'll hopefully give us a little bit of a framework that in the summer we'll be thinking about this content a little bit different, to say, hey, if this is going to be content that is sort of serialized, where it's not just for folks that are sitting in the room or watching on that weekend, but we want this to be useful and helpful as a part of the catalog of teaching at Menlo for a year from now. How do we create content in the summer that really understands itself that way?
Yeah, I just want to add, I think a big thing too that can happen in this kind of process is, like I said earlier, kind of being mad at how you were taught in the church and stuff like that. But you can also be mad at yourself. And I struggled with this when I first started this whole journey of, deconstruction, for lack of a better term. And so I just want to encourage, give yourself grace, because we're all human. We all learn things in new ways and different ways. And then I think the big key of the growing up with your faith is so important. And I know for me, my 20s was so stagnant in my faith. I just was that's what I was taught and this is what it is. And then all of a sudden my, early to mid 30s came along, and it's like, actually, there's a lot of stuff that I feels like Jesus is about this, but I was taught this. And so there was some pain of like, I can't believe I was taught it that way. And I can't believe I'm in my mid 30s and just now relearning this. And so just, give yourself grace and time. And this isn't going to change overnight. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and be like, wow, I know all these new things. It's a lifelong process and journey. So give yourself the space, find a great community if you don't have one, of people who are dealing with the same kind of things and wrestling with that kind of stuff. God wants us to wrestle with him. God wants us to ask those questions. So just give yourself the time and the space and the grace to go through all of this.
And if you don't feel any of that, if you're like, I have no tension in my faith, I hope that this series gives you something.
Yeah.
Because, we are an anti-fragile people. Like, if we face challenges and we face it in community with healthy guides, what actually happens is our faith and our life can get stronger. But because of emotional reasoning, we avoid pain. And we go, well, I don't have a problem, so I'll just kind of, no problem, just just keep swimming, just keep swimming. And I think that one of the greatest lines for that's like a symptom of that problem, I talked about this weekend from Tim Keller. If you worship a God who never disagrees with you, you may just be worshiping an idealized version of yourself. I think that is such an important statement because for a lot of us, I have no tension in my understanding of God. Like, you should. There should be some inherent tension. Like, I wouldn't do it that way, God. That should be a part of fallen humanity exploring a perfect and universal.
That's exactly it.
God.
Like, you're not God. In your mind cannot even begin to grasp God's mind.
Correct.
And so there is tension no matter what.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Jesus in the garden and how he experienced tension in that moment too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sweating blood. Yeah. That's God. Jesus, Father, is there another way? Is there a plan B available? And like, nevertheless, not my will, but yours. The best sermon I've ever heard on prayer, ever, came from Alistair Begg. Respect him a lot, like him as a communicator. And he preached that passage, and it was jaw-dropping. Just an incredible message about that. So,
well, lots to look forward to.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Phil.
welcome back, buddy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. Have a good week.
Bye.